Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of PodSaveChocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and moderator, and I'm also the creator and the publisher of TheChocolateLife.com. Today, I'm really excited to have join me David Nilsen. David is the publisher, the voice behind the Bean to Barstool podcast. And last week, David and I published an episode where he and I had a conversation about the intersection of craft beer and craft chocolate. And this week, we're back to continue that discussion. David, welcome to PodSaveChocolate.
Hey, Clay, thanks for having me on.
It was fascinating. I've been doing some sort of multimedia episode like this, either on Clubhouse or here on the Chocolate Life, for almost 3 years now, and this is the first time I've done a back-to-back episode where I appeared on some other platform and then had the host appear here. And so this has been really different for me. It's been exciting for me, and I want to do more of these kinds of episodes. But before we begin the interview portion of today's episode, what I want to do is I want to remind everybody that no matter where you're watching, whether that's YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, you can go into the live chat or the comments and you can give a shout out. Let me know where in the world you're connecting from. Or if you have a comment or a question to anything that goes on during the course of the episode, you can put it in the comments. I'll get it up on screen and we'll get the question asked and hopefully answered over the course of the hour. And with that, David, you and I are both interested in craft beer and craft chocolate. And I come at it from the chocolate side originally, and you come at it from the beer side originally. But you have this podcast which looks at the intersection between craft beer and craft chocolate. And I'm really interested what kind of responses you received to that episode.
Yeah, I mean, mostly positive. Everybody was interested in the conversation. I think the show itself in general, Bean to Barstool, is such a niche interest. Folks who have to have the curiosity to want to step outside, if they're coming from chocolate, step outside that and get into beer, or vice versa. And so while my listenership is, smaller than I would love for it to be, it is a very committed group who is curious and interested in these types of conversations. So the response was positive. People were interested in the types of conversations we're having, because I think these are the types of things that people talk about when they're just sitting around and having a beer, or whatever it is they enjoy. They're having these types of talks. So
right. I know that whenever I'm editing anything, you spend a couple of hours of something and you have a chance to go and review stuff, and you're often listening to the same thing over and over again to make sure you get the edit right. Was there anything about that episode that jumped out to you personally in the discussion? Something that you felt was new, point of view, or something that you felt that you disagreed with or agreed with? Anything that jumped out at you?
Well, one thing that stood out toward the end of the episode, I asked you what you thought chocolate could learn from beer. And your answer in there was around the importance of home brewing and how important that has been to the beer world, and how potentially a corresponding home makers a culture could really be groundbreaking for craft chocolate, to really kind of open that up to a whole new audience, and also provide kind of a pipeline for people who could potentially become pros in that. And I'd thought about it previously, but had never really given it a lot of attention. And I think you're absolutely right. So that was a really interesting point for me. Home brewing is so profoundly important in craft beer, especially historically for those first couple generations when craft beer was still finding its footing. It became such a cliche that professional brewers had started as home brewers that I stopped including that in any article I was writing about beer, because it wasn't interesting. It was so just assumed. Right. So if we could have anything like that corresponding on the chocolate side, I think it would do amazing things for, an influx of creativity, and especially because I think that barrier of entry from a monetary standpoint, while still significant, is lower for chocolate than it is for launching a brewery. So you can have a little bit more of a kind of a fuzzy barrier between the home making size and the small batch, professional size. So that really stood out to me. I would love to see conversations of how that could grow on the chocolate side.
Yeah, and I had a chance to review that and think about it. And I think that almost everybody who gets into chocolate making as a business, right, has at one point, purchased a small grinder and made chocolate in the home. And, I recognize the importance of, John Nancy's contribution, Chocolate Alchemy's contribution to all of this, right? But I think a lot of the home brew community in beer is built around getting together and sharing what it is that we brew. Right. At least
Yeah.
that was my experience in New York with the New York City Home Brewers Guild. I mean, there were regular meetings where just everybody got together and they brought their work and everybody tasted everything.
Yeah.
And the community around chocolate making has grown up online. And I don't see the same sort of local community. And I think that's where the difference lies. I mean, in thinking about that question. Right. Would you agree or disagree that there's that fundamental difference between the two communities? Because the craft chocolate community is a huge community.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely makes sense. And I think some of that gets to at least historically, the ways in which we consume beer and chocolate differently.
Right.
Beer is a communal thing. People get together to have a beer, you go out and you share beer. Chocolate is not necessarily that. Certainly can be something you enjoy with other people, but that isn't baked into the concept for chocolate. So I think there has to be a slight shift in that idea of let's get together and taste chocolate together, rather than it just being a midday treat or something you're going to sit down and close your eyes and savor on your own. So I think that kind of mindset has to shift a little bit around chocolate for that to catch on in that way, but certainly could.
Well, I mean, I think it fundamentally changes the nature of the experience. I mean, one of the things extrapolating out from that, beer, although there's a lot of beer consumption which is done by myself, by alone, right? It is going to the pub after work and getting together with friends and making beer a part of that conversation. The same thing is true of drinking wine. The same thing is, true of, many other things. And chocolate hasn't enjoyed that. There's no occasion like let's get together after work and have a bar of chocolate or have a cup of hot chocolate. It's not part of it. And I started, it's really, interesting to me how those cultural differences go on. Before we get to the next question, which I think is follows on, and it's something that we didn't cover in the first episode, I want to do a couple of quick shout outs. The first one is from Mike King, Encore Coffee Company in Kansas City, Missouri. Everybody, beer, chocolate, coffee, and bourbon fan here. Right. Absolutely. I mean, I'm a big fan as well. And we have this is in Vienna, in Austria, from Wien. Really enjoyed the podcast, David. Right, thank you both for your dedication to specialty chocolate industry and consumer education.
Thank you,
Karina. Thank you very, very much for
also.
That
I don't know if you can see, I'm wearing my Vienna Lager T-shirt here today.
Okay.
So,
right, like had you organized that with Karina?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Interestingly, there's not a whole lot of Vienna Lager brewed in Vienna these days, so it's kind of one of those weird things about the way styles travel.
Right. But... So I know what a lager is. What makes a Vienna Lager a Vienna Lager?
Yeah. So
as opposed to
is
lager.
Yeah, it's a easy drinking style, but it has a little bit more malt character. It's going to be kind of bready and toasty. Interestingly, it was actually the original pale lager style. We won't get into the weeds too much on the history, but as lager culture in Europe was developing and malting technology was allowing for paler malts to be developed, Vienna Lager was the very first style that took advantage of those technologies right around 1840, preceded Pilsner in the Czech Republic by a year or two. So Vienna Lager is the original pale lager style. If you like what is typically sold as Oktoberfest, which is a style called Märzen, Vienna Lager is like a slightly lighter, little bit lighter bodied, paler color version of that. Still has that toastiness, kind of some cozy flavors like that, but very easy drinking, very dry bodied, nice hop finish. So you get a little bit of bitterness on it. But yeah, very approachable beer style, certainly, just one that does not get brewed as often as I would like.
And I would, when I think about pilsners and lagers in general, I think of them as being generally very approachable, as a style of beer. And your description of it, you said, I think of bready yeasty beers, and I think of, British pale ales, not necessarily lagers. But just general education for people who come here from the beer side, what's the difference between a lager and an ale?
Sure. Comes down to fermentation. So there are two main species of yeast that are used to ferment 99.9% of the commercial beers out there. Ales are fermented by a species called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, prefers to ferment a little bit warmer than lager yeast, and will typically produce a little bit more of its own fermentation flavors and aromas in the finished beer. Lagers are fermented by a species called Saccharomyces pastorianus, prefers to ferment a little bit cooler than ale yeast, generally will not create as much of its own flavor and aroma, just kind of does the fermentation and gets out of the way. Additionally, lagers are usually cold conditioned for longer after fermentation to further allow those flavors to kind of smooth out and clarify. My mic might have come through wrong when I was describing that. I was saying bready and toasty, not yeasty. I would not describe Vienna lager as being yeasty at all, but it has like sort of those toasty bread flavors to it.
Gotcha. It would have been my misrepresentation because I have a particular, New York, Brooklyn beer, British pale ale sort of memory of what goes on. And that's the way I just tend to do it. So I'm going to, we're jumping around my script here in terms of the questions. So, let's go there, and maybe we'll get to some of these other questions later. But at the end of the Be to Barstool episode we did, and I just wanted to let everybody know, for every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a post on the Chocolate Life, and here's the episode right now. You can go there live. And I have links to other episodes and all kinds of resources and things like that. And you can go and, here is the link. If you haven't listened to the podcast, you can go listen to it afterwards. But one of the things, David, that you did during the episode is I brought up a couple of very, very specific beers. So I brought up the Six Deuce or the 12. Whether it's, I forget the name of the abbey that's putting it together. I also mentioned Lindem and Faro, which is a more traditional, which is a lambic style beer using a different yeast altogether, Brettanomyces. And then I also mentioned Rodenbach Grand Cru. And so, what we one of the things about learning about beer is learning about beer styles. Right. And you just, you mentioned the lager style and Pilsner style. And then within each one of those, you've got all these sub units of, differentiation, which I assume is part of, the training to become a beer judge, a Cicerone, a beer judge is, being able to pick something up and go, oh, this is what this is. Right. And we'll get to that. But, in the tastings that you put together and the pairings that you put together, do people ask about styles of chocolate, and how do you talk about styles of chocolate?
Yes, but not in quite the same way that it comes up with beer. So they're more asking broad category questions like, what is dark milk chocolate? What makes it dark and milk? Or is white chocolate chocolate? Like those kind of like bigger categories level things, rather than in beer where we've got, hundreds of potential styles. So I don't think the awareness of types of chocolate, the importance of origins, different things like that has really leaked down to the general public all that much to be asking those types of questions. Whereas I get asked a lot of questions about specific beer styles on that side of things. I think the difficult thing with looking at styles on the chocolate side is that when you're looking at single origin dark chocolate, which is kind of the spiritual backbone of craft chocolate, even though we have tons and tons of great inclusion stuff as well, that single origin stuff is kind of the center line of how this got started. If you wanted to break out single origins as being representative of styles, the analogy kind of breaks down for one thing, because so much of that has to do with post-harvest processing, roasting, refining, all sorts of different things that can change the flavor profile of an origin. But also, because you have year-to-year variability, this really operates more from a wine paradigm of grape varietals and interpretations of that, rather than specific style descriptions like you would in beer. I do think there are some corollaries between how we look at the chocolate world and the beer world when it comes to styles. In beer, you've got classic styles that have been around for a long time that have specific guidelines from a standpoint of ingredients and processes and what the expected sensory characteristics are going to be. And then each brewer can kind of subtly interpret those, but they still have to kind of stay within that description. And then you have all these beers that are just, free form, can have any additional ingredients added to them, whether it's cacao, coffee, fruit, spices, hybrids between different styles. And on the chocolate side, you've got single origin chocolate, which I kind of correlate to being similar in that sense to classic styles, where this is really a specific understanding of how these are going to be made. They're going to be, two ingredients. They're going to be highlighting, these specific expectations. And then you've got inclusion chocolate, which is sort of the equivalent of what I was just describing with those beers, where a brewer can just do whatever they have in their imagination. And those two things can live in harmony with each other. They can live kind of in tension with each other. Sometimes there's this tension in beer between protecting tradition and experimenting and just having fun, and can those things coexist? And in chocolate, I think that same thing can exist between the single origin, kind of highlighting this core ingredient, and then just using chocolate as a platform for the imagination of the maker and all the different flavors that they can come up with. I think those things can live beautifully in harmony together. But I think that there can sometimes maybe be a little bit of a tension between those as well. But I don't think style exists in quite the same way in chocolate as it does in beer, but I think that there are sort of broad analogies that you can draw across.
Right. So we might think of dark and milk and white, maybe ruby, right, as styles of chocolate, right, as broad categories of chocolate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we might have single origin might express itself as a single origin milk or a single origin dark. I mean, that certainly fits.
Sure.
So these are, ways that they go together, and blends as opposed to non-blends. And then I'm thinking about things like, IBU, International Bitterness Units, and how it gets, assigned to individual beer styles, more connected to, I think, IPAs than any other style, although certainly IBU is a measurement that we get into. And so, when I was worrying about my original rating system, I was thinking, okay, I want to place chocolate sort of culturally. And so I said, okay, here's a Northern European style of chocolate making, which is, sort of representative of the Swiss and Belgian approaches, maybe the Dutch approaches, has a tendency to be lighter and sweeter than a Southern European style, which is a tendency to be darker and more rich and things like that. And I don't know so the question, is making these distinctions helpful, useful, as we strive to come to whatever craft means, right? However we decide to come down on that definition, styles don't appear to be a part of the definition for craft beer. I can be crafty and it doesn't really matter what it is that I'm making. Do I understand correctly?
Yes, there have been some points in the past where there has been a little bit of restriction, not specifically around style, but around a handful of ingredients that were being used in some mass-produced styles, that kind of became like shadow bans on those styles in some ways, but that is a thing of the past, thankfully. There is nothing that stipulates what a craft brewery has to brew to be considered craft.
Or should not brew in order to be
Or
considered.
should not brew. Exactly. Yes.
Gotcha. And so, when you put together a craft beer and a craft chocolate pairing event, right? What are your primary considerations? How do you approach putting them together, and how does this notion of style come into it? And then, how you think about introducing the concept of craft, right, and putting them together, right?
Wow, that's three big questions there altogether. Starting with the style idea, you asked in the middle of the question there, is it helpful to think about style? And I actually wrote a blog post about this a few months back, kind of questioning like, what is the value of our taxonomies within beer and our organizational systems for how we, keep track of all these different beer styles. And correspondingly on the chocolate side, is there value in trying to learn more about the specific characteristics of origins and trying to be sort of prescriptive in saying Madagascar has these characteristics, or does that get us off base? And for me personally, and I'm not going to assign this to anybody else and say how to use these systems. For me, I found both of those sort of systems very helpful when I was in an earlier learning stage. Of course, I'm always learning, but in an earlier stage where you had just this overwhelming amount of information. When I was first getting into beer in a more serious way, one of the great things about beer is its variety. And one of the maddening things about beer when you're trying to learn about it is its variety. And so having a sort of systematic theology that would just like break down all of the different styles and give me exact characteristics and ingredients and processes for those, so that I could just make sense of all that information and kind of start building a framework in my head. That was very, very helpful early on. As I have grown in my knowledge as a professional in the beer space, I see more and more shades of gray, more and more places where the rules and guidelines don't apply anymore. And that doesn't mean that those rules and guidelines weren't helpful. It meant that they were helpful for me for a time. And now I need to add complexity and nuance into that understanding. On the chocolate side, similarly, it is so difficult when you're first getting into craft chocolate to understand what all these origins are telling you. What does it mean that a bar is from Vanuatu versus from Bolivia versus from wherever? And it's, in some ways, it's even less helpful because there can be that year-over-year variation. There can be that maker-to-maker variation. So much of it depends on what happens after harvest. But it was still helpful, I think, early on to at least be able to say, okay, Madagascar is going to be fruity, or whatever those things are, to at least provide some framework and then work from there. So I think that those styles, such as they exist in chocolate and the styles as they exist in beer, can play a role as long as we understand what they are not telling us. They are not actually providing a perfect prescriptive explanation of everything you're going to need to understand about, flavor for these two things. They play a role. They point us in the right direction. They help us organize information. Then we just have to kind of layer on from experience a deeper understanding. When it comes to pairing and how I do that, typically, because I am coming from the beer space, the pairings I'm putting together tend to be in association with a beverage alcohol provider, whether that is a bar or a brewery. So I'm usually working with their tap list and saying, okay, what are some great beers on here that I'm going to be able to find easy pairings for? Some of those might be immediate. I see this style. I have something that I like to go back to. I know it's going to be a crowd pleaser. That one's pretty easy. Other times it's a little bit more of a challenge. I find an interesting combination of ingredients or flavors in a particular beer and say, that could be fun, and try to figure out something that works there. Some cases I do have
I want
particular.
to jump in there and interrupt you. What's the hardest beer style to pair with that in your experience?
There's a couple that I functionally don't pair with because they are so challenging. Anything that is very, very dry bodied with high hop bitterness. So West Coast IPA, German style Pilsner. Those two in particular are nearly impossible. And you could lump in something like Italian style Pilsner, anything that has high hop bitterness and very, very little malt character, very dry bodied. There's really nothing to bridge, and all you're going to get is harshness from that bitterness. There's nothing that's going to be able to temper that in any way. So I generally don't even look at those styles. I would love if somebody is just found something I've missed and you have a great West Coast IPA pairing. I'm skeptical, but I would love to find out and try it. But I generally don't even look at those.
Gotcha. My experience with that is I'm looking at sort of the hop style and what it is that the hop brings to the beer. And so depending, is there a really piney resinous quality that I might be able to use it? Is there a real sort of fruity quality to it? So I find that what I have to do is I actually have to jump into the hop varietal in order to see if I can make it, if I can find a bridge. But that high IBU IPA, is definitely on my list of really, really hard beers to pair.
The problem with varietal and hops, though, is it's very similar to cacao origin in that it depends largely on how it is used. You can get different characteristics from the same hop being used differently, particularly when it comes to blends. If you're using hops in conjunction with each other, it's not always 1 + 1 = 2. So sometimes using a couple hops together, you might think that's going to create this flavor, and you actually get this other third flavor that you're not expecting. Additionally, the yeast that you're using in conjunction with that hop, and when the hop is being added, you can get biotransformation and new compounds that create whole new flavors. And so I'm looking more at dryness of body and bitterness level when I'm looking at an IPA. Then once I've got that in place to know, okay, this is going to be able to play with the flavors in a friendly way, then I will zero in on specific, this flavor I think will work with this flavor.
Understood. I think I sort of know that intuitively, but because my focus been on the chocolate side and not really going deep dive into the vocabulary of the beer,
Sure.
I don't necessarily think of it that way descriptively. It's just sort of in my brain, and I think that that's one of the things in talking about it. So, jumping the script here, what I want to do is, number one, interject briefly and do a quick reset. You're watching Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. My guest today is David Nilsen of the Bean to Barstool podcast, and we're talking craft beer, craft chocolate, pairings, and all sorts of things. If you're watching today, no matter whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, go into the chat. In the comments, let us know where in the world you're connecting from. We'll get the shout out on the screen. And if you have a question for David, please ask that question and we'll get it up on screen and asked and answered today as well. So, and in the reset, I lost my train of thought. So let's go back. Let's go back to this. Let's ask the other question, which is, what is your favorite style, or what style of beer do you find easiest to pair with? Which is a different question. And then what kind of chocolate style, type of chocolate, rather than specific brands, although you can mention specific brands if you want to, do you think go with those beers?
Okay, sure. So looking at easiest chocolate styles to work with, the great leveler, the thing that makes a beer style easy to work with usually is sweetness. So if a beer style has a level of residual sweetness, that is going to blanket over a lot of rough edges that might pop up otherwise. So looking at a style like English barley wine. English barley wine is a very malt forward style that has a lot of residual sweetness to it. It's not overly intense on hop bitterness, has some underlying fermentation flavors. It is easily, I would say, the most versatile pairing style because of that sweetness level and the fact that the malt flavors and the fermentation flavors are going to reach out to a lot of different chocolate flavors. You've got flavors of dried fruit, uh, toffee, caramel, all these different things that are going to be able to have a lot of branches that go off from them when you're trying to pair them up with other things. So if I were to tell people to have one style and just get several chocolates to try with it, get an English style barley wine. They're not going to be at your corner supermarket or corner gas station, but if you go to a decent bottle shop, they'll have some English barley wines. Grab something like that, and it's going to work with a lot of different things well.
So you use the words branches, and earlier you used the word bridges, which I think is the term that I like to use. Is that there is this connection, there is the bridge you can make between the flavors of the chocolate and the flavors of the beer. But there are two questions around that. The first one comes from Mike at Encore, who says, right, since bitterness sounds like a challenge when pairing, is there a specific IBU limit you try to stick below, right? And the other one is alcohol content. Because I think of barley wines as being higher alcohol, right, than a lighter Pilsner might be. And so how does alcohol content fit into the questions about pairing?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the bitterness one. There is not a specific number I look at, and that highlights one of the problems with the IBU scale itself. So IBU, as Clay said, stands for International Bitterness Units. It is a measurement of the amount of isomerized hop alpha acid that is in the beer. That is the compound that creates bitterness from hops in beer. That is a helpful measurement for the brewer when they're writing a recipe to say, we know that this hop has this alpha acid content. And so if we add it to the beer for this long, we will get this much expected bitterness. And that's helpful when they're trying to plan a recipe to say about how much bitterness do we want, how much do we want to balance that out with malt, et cetera, et cetera. About 15 years ago, the IBU number started getting shared with consumers because for a short period of time, the big thing in IPA, which is the most popular family of styles in craft beer, was bitterness. And so brewers were competing with each other to make the most bitter IPA that they could. And so having a high IBU number was kind of a marketing thing to be able to say, oh, our IPA is this bitter, it's this number. And you started getting numbers that weren't even mathematically possible, frankly, if you actually understand the science of how this works. But thankfully, we are past that. But that IBU number has still kind of held on and still gets used on a lot of beer packaging and brewery tap lists and things like that. And it is a very, very misleading number if you don't understand the context that it fits in. You can have two beers with the same IBU number, and one of them will seem much more bitter than the other based on how much residual sweetness is in the beer, how much malt flavor is in the beer. Are there other ingredients that have been added that are going to be in that matrix? Our perceived bitterness is different from the actual measured bittering compound level. So when I'm looking at a beer and trying to evaluate if that bitterness is going to be a problem, I'm not looking at an IBU number because that's not going to give me that whole picture. I need to know how perceptible is that bitterness relative to the overall balance of the beer. Bitterness and sweetness are not opposites of each other. You can have a lot of bitterness and a lot of sweetness. And if you have a lot of sweetness, that is going to swallow a lot of that bitterness and make it much more easy to work with. So there is no specific IBU limit that I would work with. I'm looking at how does that bitterness fit within the balance of the beer and the sweetness and other flavors that are present there to cushion that. Clay, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your half of the question was.
Alcohol content.
Alcohol content, yes. So higher alcohol beers, and this is not a true across the board thing, higher alcohol beers tend to also have a little bit fuller body to them. And there will sometimes then be a little bit more residual sweetness. So I am not at all scared of higher alcohol beers in pairing, as long as there is that little bit of body to it, because that intensity of flavor, that fullness of body, little bit of residual sugar is going to temper any harshness that you could, or solvency character that you could potentially get from the alcohol in some pairings. That said, if I'm working with a beer that has a high alcohol content, I will usually, unless it has a lot of sweetness to it, I will usually stay away from chocolates that have a more aggressive spice profile as an actual inclusion. You know, if they're using a lot of cinnamon or, you know, something like that, if there isn't enough sweetness in that overall pairing to kind of hold on to that, those spices I find can make that alcohol read harsher than it would. It'll just kind of grab it and pull it out, make it seem kind of solventy. So there isn't, on both of these questions, there is not an upper limit on either bitterness level or alcohol. It's just the context of why are those in the beer and what else is in the beer.
Right. And how they might either be complementary to the chocolate or might detract from the chocolate, and, you know, and vice versa. I mean, you have to pick a chocolate that will go with the beer. Although, you know, as we discussed, you know, in pairing, sometimes the most interesting, you know, times during a tasting event is when you get something which works for some people and doesn't work for other people, and then all of a sudden you have this fabulous discussion about what is it that you like and what is it you don't like, and you get into what people are perceiving, which I think is where we start talking. I mean, I always shoot for failures, as I mentioned.
Well, I think the higher the risk, the higher the reward. So I will, when I'm doing a pairing and I'm doing, you know, four courses, 5 courses, something like that, I want a few courses in there that I know are likely to appeal to the group. They're not going to be overly demanding of anybody. They're going to be flavors I know are very comfortable together. I want a couple in there, first of all, to kind of prove the concept to newcomers that yes, this really can work, beer and chocolate together. And also because I think people need resting points during a pairing where they're not being challenged every time, and they can kind of come back to a comfortable flavor combination. But those are also unlikely to be the most popular, or you know, the most exciting pairing for anybody. You're not going to get to the end and anybody's going to point back to one of those and be like, that was mind-blowing. So the other courses in there, I want to be ones that have the higher ceiling. The people who love this are really going to love it, but also then potentially the higher risk, where the people who don't like it are going to have a very, very negative reaction to that flavor combination. So with that risk goes reward. You know, you'll have those higher ceilings, but also probably the lower valleys, whereas those safer pairings are just kind of going to be easy for everybody.
Listen, I understand exactly what you're talking about there, and I think that what you're trying to represent, you know, who the client is, who you're doing the presentation for, is also going to drive some of those selections. So if you're there for a brewery representing their beers, probably you want to err on the side of making sure everything tastes good, rather than having something which doesn't work. I mean, you know, if I were doing that, if I was looking for, you know, a real unbridled lambic, you know, something that had that real strong barnyardy lambic, Brettanomyces, you know, yeastiness, I probably might not go there with you know, an audience of newbies, which is we you know, culturally we think about pairing chocolate and wine. So do you find that you need to really get people over the hump to believing that pairing chocolate and beer is possible to begin with, and you might have some, you know, really, really positive tasting experiences with it too? I mean, are we at that level of education with a large number of the people that you're talking to?
I wouldn't say it's most of the group. I think, especially if these are ticketed events, if people have put down money, they're obviously open to this experience, or they already are, you know, they're very prepared to enjoy this together, or they've done it before. But somebody has brought along a spouse, or they've convinced a friend to come with them, and you can just kind of tell from the front of the room that this person is maybe not enthusiastic. Like, they're willing to give this a try, but you're going to need to prove to them that this works. So it's not most of the group, but I think there's always a few of those in there. That said, I think a lot of people default to thinking, when you're talking beer and chocolate, they default to porters and stouts, because they already have those chocolatey coffee flavors in there, and so it's a very easy pairing. And certainly porters and stouts can pair beautifully with the right kinds of chocolate, but people don't necessarily think about the entire world of other beer styles as potentially working with chocolate, and in some cases specific styles they're like they would never put with that. So we talked earlier about West Coast IPA, which is a branch of IPA that is very dry bodied and higher in bitterness. But the most popular group of IPAs right now are hazy IPAs or New England style IPAs. They have lower bitterness, usually have a little bit more body to them, and these very expressive fruity flavors. And they can pair fantastically with the right chocolates. And people are never expecting a big fruity hazy IPA with chocolate. That's just not something that is sitting in their mind if they haven't done this before. So there are certainly individual pairings where I can tell I need to kind of get the group on board with this idea. They're going to try it. They're curious. They're eager to try it, but they are holding back in their mind a little bit. IPA with chocolate, or whatever the style is that I'm doing that with. So there are definitely steps there where I need to convince the group that this really is going to be awesome. Just try it.
Right. So shifting gears just a little bit, you and I have both been judges in the same competition, chocolate competition, right? I've tasted the results of beer competition, although I'm not trained as a judge. I have friends who are trained as certified beer judges. For you, what is there a difference in approach in the way you think about, number one, the rubric for judging beer, right? And how there is a very, very specific one, and how you approach judging chocolate. Are they the same? Are they different? How do they overlap?
Well, I will say I have not done any professional chocolate judging. So I've done like written reviews, but I have not actually sat on a judging panel on the chocolate side.
You were not a part of the Craft Chocolate Challenge judging panel? I thought that you were. Okay.
Yeah.
I misunderstood.
I would
All right.
I would love to do that at some point, but I have not actually done that on a technical side. But I think that the question still is valid of how do we approach evaluating these things. And I think that the tension with judging, it goes back to what I was describing earlier about the problem of styles, where when you're judging a particular classic style, you have again, this is beer. You've got these very specific guidelines of this flavor should not be present, or this flavor should be present, or this is what the balance of this should be. And because a beer falls outside of that does not mean it's a bad beer. It means it isn't this style, or isn't the best example of this style. And that's kind of an uncomfortable tension, I think, where we're trying to very rigidly define this is good at being this. It might be really good. It's just not good at being that. And so it should fit somewhere else. And that's kind of a weird thing to hold in balance. You're tasting a good beer that you would drink more of, but it doesn't fit the rigid, definition that's being given for this particular category. There's a well-known beer writer and judge named Randy Mosier. He has a book called Tasting Beer. That's kind of the book I point anybody to if they just want to start from nowhere and learn the basics of beer and really get into it as an enthusiast, without being intimidated in any way. And I was asking him about judging a while back, and he has judged the biggest beer competitions for decades. And he was saying, when you get down to the end of a competition, so you're at the best in show table, every beer that's sitting here is excellent. Suddenly those guidelines go out the window, and it's about which of these is the most memorable, which of these am I going to like the most. Everything's been vetted by that point. You're not worrying about this isn't to style. It's just which of these is something I'm going to tell somebody about afterward. And so you have to completely shift gears from how you've been doing this entire competition to now at the end, suddenly it is entirely hedonic. It's entirely subjective at that point. And he said that retroactively, one of the problems that he then feels like going backward in those rounds of judging is that judging inherently minimizes wonderfulness, as he describes it. Like you are you are trying to cordon off something and say it fits this definition well, but it doesn't allow you to be more subjective and say, man, this is good. This is something I would want to drink more of, regardless of how it fits into those categories. So I think, not having done a professional chocolate competition, as you have done many, I suspect, and I could be wrong, that maybe chocolate has a little bit more freedom there because you don't have those super rigid historical style guidelines where a Vienna lager, goes back to 1840, and we've been brewing it without too much change since then. And so the idea of what a Vienna lager is this very specific thing. Whereas with chocolate, you're judging more within, maybe percentages, maybe broader categories. This is dark, this is milk, this is dark milk, this is white, this is inclusion, whatever. And you have a little bit more flexibility to say, okay, as long as it checks those marks, are there major flaws? If there aren't major flaws, which of these are best? Like, which of these are just really good chocolates? And correct me if I'm wrong, tell me if that is not the experience, but it seems like there would be less rigidity potentially.
Well, I think it all depends on which competition you're talking about, right? So, so the International Chocolate Awards is now building its judging process around this tasting methodology, which has been created out of the International Institute for Cocoa and Chocolate Tasting, or Chocolate and Cocoa Tasting. And the Academy of Chocolate uses a different rubric, and the Northwest Chocolate Awards uses a different rubric. And or the Chocolate Alliance Awards, they all use different rubrics. And so there's no way to directly compare the results from one competition to another competition, sure, because they're all judging different things in different ways, right? And in many judging forums, there is this question, which is the hedonic, like, do you like this? Would you recommend this to friends? Would you buy it again? Right. So we do have that aspect to it, but they tend, primarily to be around, tell me what the chocolate looks like, right? Does it look like it's well made, right? Does it have, if it's a dark chocolate, does it have a nice sheen? And that award is worth 10% of the overall score. And then you go, what is the aroma? Right. And in there, we're also looking at tempering and the snap. And then we're going to look at texture, and then we're going to look at overall flavor. And so we're going to judge it. We're going to give scores to each one of those attributes according to the rubric that the organizer of the competition has done. So it's a 0 or it's a 4, you choose, right, what it's going to be. And in the end, the final score is going to be primarily a mathematical representation. It's going to be a summation of all of the scores that have been given by all of the judges for a given product. So it tends to be more rigid and more pedantic in some respects.
Well, and that what you're describing of that scoring based on particular characteristics is what we do on the beer side. What I'm looking at more is within the requirements of each of those categories, it feels like maybe chocolate is not having to hew to such a specific guideline of this is in the style or this is not.
Right. And so I would agree with you. And so there are no styles in chocolate like there are in beer. So, the categories are going to be dark chocolates above 70%, dark chocolates above 90%. Milk chocolate, right, is going to be a category. We might have a category that talks about chocolates that are produced in a producing country, right? That might be a way to represent things. But for the most part, all dark chocolates get judged against each other. And so it is the organizer of the competition who looks at the ingredient list and said, this chocolate fits in this category, right? And this chocolate fits in this category. And then you as a judge don't get to say, this doesn't belong in this category, right? And we're not judging, there are no, a 70% 2-ingredient chocolate, right, must have the following characteristics associated with it in order for it to be. So we're not judging technically at that level because we actually don't have specific styles that are associated with things. So in that way, it is less rigid. But I think that there tends to be a focus on the judging rubric, right, associated with, is it well made? Is it a well made example of its kind? So what is the texture? What is the snap and sheen? You know, what is the aroma? There are some gustatory aspects to those things. But this hedonic, do I like it? Right? Would I, you know, is it a good example of its kind? You know, would I recommend it? Those tend to be, depending upon the competition, they're more or less important.
Sure.
You know, and so it is fundamentally different. And I think what we do is we find there are attempts to say, how do we take sort of a W set, so the wine education system, and apply it to chocolate, or how do we take the beer judging system and apply it to chocolate? And I think that the fact that, you know, even though, you know, beer and chocolate share both fermentation flavors and roasting flavors, making it very different from wine, which has only got fermentation flavors, and coffee, which has only got roasting flavors. Right? The fact that you know, the only other like really gourmet food category that I can think of that equates to chocolate would be cheese, because of the fat content. Right? And so I think you know, attempts to judge chocolate the same way we judge wine and beer fail, because there's this fundamental aspect about the nature of the release of flavor having to do with fat that gets overlaid. And we can't say, you have this particular notion of what a Vienna lager is, right, through training your taste memory. I've tasted lots of them, right? I've got a guide that says, oh, you know, this has got an off note, so it's not a good example, right. Of this. And we don't have any of that. It's not possible to reliably say, this is the flavor of chocolate made from beans from Madagascar,
right? Or
this is the flavor of chocolate made from beans from another country. And so it puts chocolate in an entirely different place. Is it fair to be able to judge Peruvian chocolate and Ecuadorian chocolate made from different beans? It's an interesting question that I don't know that anybody has done. And I don't know that it would be productive, right? I'm not suggesting that we do it, but
I think, and one thing I believe we talked about this on my show last week, that most of the chocolate competitions I've seen don't do a ordered winners list of this, in this category, this was your first place, second place, third place. It is based upon those scores that you talked about. And so everything that's above a score threshold is a gold. Everything between these numbers is a silver. I see a lot of merit to that, because you're not necessarily, for one thing, there isn't the hubris of, we decided this is the one best chocolate, so it's better than this second place chocolate. You know, it allows for a little bit more of a diversity of flavors to have this same quality rating. But also, I mean, it's not so limited in that, I mean, it can say like, okay, these are all of the chocolates that we think are just at the top of the heap right now, and here's ones that are just really worth. It's almost more of like a Michelin star type rating, where it's not saying this is the best, it's saying this is one you really seek out, this is one that you seek out, you know, if you have the opportunity, or so on. But I kind of like that. I like the idea of just, here's all the ones that we thought were at this level, rather than drum roll, first, second, third place. There's excitement in that first, second, third place in beer competitions, but it's also like, I know there were a lot of other good beers that were judged in that category.
Right. And sometimes what you run is the difference between making a gold and making a silver can be 2/100ths of a point. You know, it's like sometimes the discretion is like, you know that when you look at the raw scores, and we're now seeing some of them, that the differentiation is like not something you can taste. It has to be an artifact of the mathematics that are used to generate.
It's like my mindset in the morning when I see that the high is going to be 89 degrees versus 91 degrees is wildly different, even though I know that they're going to feel basically the same. But in the 91, I'm dreading, because it just sounds like so much hotter than 89.
Absolutely. And we had that discussion last time. There's something psychologically very, very different. I mean, 87 and 89 are 2 points apart, and 89 and 91 are 2 points apart. But that 91, right, psychologically has a much, much greater impact. David, we're close to the end of the hour.
All right.
And there's still questions. I mean, it's gone on, and I know that your podcast went to an hour and 20, but that's because of interstitials that you did and other things like that. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that we don't leave today with what I think is just sort of a really, really fundamental question, which is, what do you think that craft chocolate can learn from craft beer? And what do you think that craft beer can learn from craft chocolate?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all right, I'll start then with what I think chocolate can learn from beer. And a lot of what I think it can learn from beer is learning from beer's mistakes and learning some of the missteps that craft beer has had over the decades, that it can maybe head off before they become problems. Craft beer is several decades older than when we would kind of mark the beginning of craft chocolate. And so it has had the ability to watch this older industry and look at the problems it's had over the years and the problems it potentially has now, and maybe prevent some of those. One of those, I think, is related to what you and I talked about last week, Clay, which is the definition of craft. And we discussed the fact that the stakes are different because you have the concerns for farmers and farm laborers on the chocolate side that don't exist in beer. But just looking at the desire to kind of carve out what does craft mean and who gets to be in that and who doesn't, I think that beer has made a lot of mistakes in how it has gone about trying to define that. And I think some of that is laid at the feet of the main trade organization within craft beer, the Brewers Association. And I don't say this to demonize them. They were given a very difficult task of deciding who do we represent and who do we not represent as an organization. But I think for a long time, craft beer sought to define itself by what it was not, rather than defining itself by what it was. It was defined by being reactionary rather than being creative and positive. When craft beer was just forming and getting its legs under it in the early 1980s, it was largely a rebellion to what was perceived as this sort of monolith of just very homogenous, boring, mass-produced beer. And so it was largely defined by not being that. We're not going to be big. We're not going to be boring. We're not, for a long time, we're not going to brew the same styles. And it was just all, we're not that, we're not that, we're not that. And as the industry matured and grew in size, and the companies involved grew in size, and the realities of large scale distribution of consumer packaged goods grew, those things that they were trying to define themselves as not being became less and less able to be defended. Really, it became much more complex, much more nuanced, and suddenly now you're left with an industry definition that doesn't actually have a positive, proactive statement of like, this is what we're doing. It was all, we're not this. And so I want to make sure that as craft chocolate is having those conversations about how do we define what we are, how do we decide what gets to use these different terms. But for one thing, it doesn't do that in a purely reactionary way, that it doesn't just say we aren't this, that it has proactive things it wants to be, that it can put words to. And this is tricky. And again, I don't want to demonize the Brewers Association because they were given a very difficult task, but that it holds these definitions with an open hand, that it writes things in chalk and says, right now, this is kind of helping us group together what's there, but we know we're probably going to need to erase this part. We know we're going to do these things, and like just do that in a way that does not say, no, this cannot be in the club because it is this specific thing. And I am now in opposition to what you're doing because we have different interpretations of how this works. Calm down, step back from the conversation. It's fine to want to define these words. I think they're profitable conversations. I think they're interesting conversations, but do them in pencil and do them in ways that do not create fractures and walls and hard lines within the industry, so that later then you have to kind of uncomfortably disassemble when you realize that there was more complexity than you thought there was at first. So I think that's one significant thing. I think that we need to work on education from the beginning at the consumer level. not just at the maker level. We talked about homebrewing. Homebrewing was a fantastic way to get consumers involved in the industry. But unless you had a vested interest there, you were going to homebrew, you were going to actually get your hands dirty. There was almost no consumer education in what we were talking about with beer styles for a long time. You had to have already passed a certain barrier of entry before you could really start to understand what was going on. And now we're trying to backtrack way too late and provide that kind of consumer education on the beer side. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that makes beer so great is its variety, but it's also kind of our Achilles heel because it is overwhelming for newcomers to understand these 150 styles and all these different ingredients. On the chocolate side, I think we need to be incorporating that from the beginning, whether that is through social media, through proactive communication, newsletters, whether it is events, whether it is at the point of sale. We are going to make sure that our public-facing employees are proactively having conversations to encourage curiosity and build understanding. Because once the industry has grown, optimistically, let's say the segment continues to grow, it becomes too late at that point to try to get that sort of ground level education level and general understanding, because that knowledge level, that education is where you get long-term buy-in and investment in being committed to the segment, rather than, yeah, I'll try this, and then there's something else shiny and you go off and chase that. So I think that's a really important one. One of the things I think that chocolate has as an advantage, not being a beverage, is that it has so many other connoisseur segments that it can easily infiltrate through pairings, through collaborations. Chocolate can be involved in wine, it can be involved in beer, it can be involved in coffee, it can be involved in spirits, and it can easily do that. And I think that that is something that the industry should lean into, building those relationships and trying to grow a customer base, not just from the epicenter as we are, getting into craft chocolate and we're just going to slowly nudge this boundary out, but proactively, let's reach out to beer and wine and the makers in those spaces and the hospitality businesses in those spaces, the publications in those spaces, and get them invested and interested in what we're doing, and actually get people from there interested in craft chocolate, rather than just trying to slowly nudge the boundary outward from the center with chocolate. What I think that beer can learn from chocolate, and some of this is tricky because of the entry level cost involved that we talked about with starting a brewery. It's just unbelievably expensive, even at the smallest scale. But I think that's because, or partially because, we have a very specific business model in place of what it means to be a commercial brewery. And I would love for beer to learn from chocolate some of the flexibility of business model in how, what it means that you are a commercial brewery. I had some friends out in Denver who now have a large tap room, but they started out doing basically what they called I don't remember the acronym they used, was basically a CSA, where they brewed functionally at a large homebrew scale, had a commercial brewing license, had people buy in for memberships, and every 4 to 6 weeks, they would come in and pick up their allotment of beer. And it allowed them to operate at a very small scale without a lot of investment capital until they were able to scale up to the next level. That is difficult. I'm not trying to pretend that it's just as easy as think outside the box and suddenly this will be easy to do. But I think there are other models beyond the way that we have been going around. You have to have a big tap room, or you have to be out in major distribution. I think there are other creative ways that you could be a beer business without doing that. And then one other thing that I will share that I think is important is learning from the way that craft chocolate has handled its branding and its storytelling and its flavor description. Beer, largely as a consequence of that homebrewing culture that we talked about. This industry was built on homebrewing in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and the homebrewing competitions that went along with that. And because of that, we developed, I think, very concrete ways of describing the thing that we're making. This is this style. It used these exact ingredients, and these are the flavors that we use to describe that style.
Right.
That is helpful for the consumer on one level, because then if we say on a beer can that this beer has these 3 flavors, then okay, the consumer has some idea of what to expect. But we never expanded what flavor can do beyond that, and to help people kind of understand how that can dovetail with story, and how you can kind of build in some whimsy and some romance to the fact that we used these ingredients, or this beer tastes this way. Chocolate has done that from the beginning. Chocolate, and I think largely this is because it is something we all had as children, and so we are primed to kind of be romantic and whimsical about chocolate. But chocolate packaging and social media and all sorts of things, it leans in heavily to the romance and the storytelling and the whimsy and the nostalgia of describing the product that you're selling. Sometimes I think the trade-off is that they don't do as much to let the consumer know what it's actually going to taste like, and I think they can do that. But I think that beer could learn a lot from being willing to kind of get more investment and curiosity from the casual consumer by telling a story and using your branding in a really thoughtful way. We still have, largely because this started out as a boys club in people's garages in the 80s, but we still have a lot of breweries that are doing the equivalent of like Microsoft Paint for their logos. I mean, it's just these really tacky looking labels, and sometimes very childish, if not outright problematic beer names. Like, if we could just look to a younger, smaller industry for the kind of maturity and holistic way that they're approaching their branding, and the way that they're approaching their storytelling, I think that beer would be approachable to an audience that it is not always approachable to right now.
So I'm the host, and so I'm gonna take invoke privilege and respond to a couple of things. The first one of which is that one of the things about chocolate packaging is there's a lot more variability. I mean, there are only so many sizes of beer cans and beer bottles, and so there are restrictions in packaging when it comes to beer that do not exist in chocolate.
But it's also a bigger canvas. It's also, I mean, you've got a lot of space you can work with to do different things.
Yes, but I would argue that if I have a wrapper which unfolds as opposed to a box, right, or flow wrap, I have a lot more space to work with. And I'm just saying that there is, these are differences that we need to recognize, right? And another thing I think you pointed out, which I was going to bring up, is that in beer, I think there is a tendency to think about a funny name, right, and a funny visual. Clown shoes, is the first one that comes to mind, right? And so there tends to be this sort of sophomoric teenage humor approach to things. Sometimes the visuals are incredibly sophisticated, but there tends to be this focus more on that aspect of things, or a memorable name and a memorable image as opposed to a memorable story. And so I think that we can talk around those differences. You brought up a really, really important point about age, is that most people start eating chocolate around the age of 2 or 3.
Right.
And my preferences for chocolate tend to be canalized at a very young age, and I need to grow out of them, right, as I grow older. Right. Whereas I don't start drinking coffee usually until I hit puberty, and I'm not going to start drinking beer and wine seriously for taste as opposed just for the alcohol until I'm much later. And so there's a fundamental difference in the approaches that we have and what it is that we're bringing to this. If I grew up, thinking that, Hershey's was the best chocolate in the world and a s'more was the greatest thing that you could do with chocolate, my expectations are in very different places than, when I start drinking beer and I start drinking chocolate. We do need to factor those things in when we think about the education process, because when it comes to beer education, I'm starting with a much older, hopefully a much better educated, and hopefully a much more sophisticated consumer than a 3-year-old can ever hope to be.
Yes, one would hope.
One would hope. And then finally, I think there's something interesting about when the craft chocolate movement really got kickstarted. It was actually bean to bar, and that was Scharfenberger in 1996. And the phrase bean to bar was coined as a reaction to European chocolate. I mean, John Scharfenberger, who was a champagne blender at Veuve Clicquot, had started a California sparkling wine business and sold it and funded Scharfenberger. Basically said, we want to be the American Valrhona, but we want to be better, right? And we're going to do everything that big chocolate isn't. And we're going to define bean to bar in ways. We're small, we're going to do 2 ingredient. We're going to be rough. We're not going to be, take all the edges and smooth them over like all these, big chocolate makers and all these European chocolate makers do. So unfortunately, that is the origin story of, how the bean to bar chocolate movement started, defining itself in opposition to what other chocolate was. And it's difficult to get beyond that, as you pointed out. I mean, they're still struggling, with, what it means to be bean to bar and where do you cut the edges off. If you don't do this, you're not bean to bar. If you do this, you're not bean to bar. And so it's got to be a bigger tent than that. We need to think about it very, very differently. Definitionally, what's the difference between craft chocolate and artisan chocolate? Oh my gosh, after 30 years, we're still having these definitional fights, and right. As I pointed out, we're confused. No wonder consumers are confused about what it is that goes on. And so I do want to ask the question, do you think that an organization like either the Specialty Coffee Association or the Craft Brewers Association has a place in what I'm going to call specialty chocolate? Because I like, as you know, anybody who listened to the previous episode knows I prefer specialty as a place to go move to as a definition. But do you think there's a place for that kind of, because we don't have one in chocolate. There is no one organization that represents a large number of makers.
Yeah, that's really tough. And as I brought up several times, like I'm sympathetic to the Brewers Association, even as I criticize them, because at the moment you spring into existence, you have to be able to say who you're aligned with and who you aren't. I think looking at the coffee side of things, you brought up last week the grading for, the Q scores and things like that, and what can be specialty. I think that something that provides a little bit more of a framework at the ingredient level, just for, helping makers and growers understand what kind of standards and minimums and things are there, could certainly be helpful. Looking at it more on the beer side, where this is more a consumer, facing thing for defining this, I wish there were a clean definition that we could all agree to where I could say yes, but I feel like while the Brewers Association has done a tremendous amount of good from a visibility standpoint of being able to pool resources in order to promote the industry as a whole, whether that's through festivals, competitions, that's been very good. I also think that it has been able to, in some cases, lobby on the legislative side for advantageous distribution laws or production laws and different things for craft beer. I feel like at this point, it might have served its purpose, because at this point, I don't think, first of all, craft beer is not in a great place from a market standpoint, from a business standpoint. We're not in a good spot right now. So we're not seeing the kind of explosive growth that we were, where these questions felt a little bit more relevant. But I feel like right now we've got more angst from more members of the rank and file craft brewers about what the Brewers Association is, than there is gratitude and excitement for anything they might be doing. And I think the idea of being able to pool resources to promote craft chocolate as a whole, or specific makers, has a lot of value. And I would be curious, and I have not come up with this idea, but I would be curious to hear other people's ideas on how that could be done in a sort of decentralized way, something that did not require an organization with a membership. Like is there a way that makers can pool resources to promote their own purposes without having to say, okay, we have now placed a king on the throne so the king can tell us what to do, sort of, which is what I feel like we got on the other side.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very delicate balancing, process. And I want to say, David, thanks for being willing to stay late. I mean, we're 15 minutes past the hour. This is a fascinating conversation. And what I want to do is say, we're both going to be involved in an event in Brussels in October. So it's the British Society of Flavorists. It's their annual meeting. You're going to be doing a beer and chocolate pairing because the focus of this meeting is going to be on chocolate. I'm doing a much more technical presentation with Zoe Papalexandrato on quantifying the flavors of chocolate. So, but what I'd like to do is let's do this again when we come back, right? And find out, I think it's a really, really valuable set of conversations to have. What I want to do is to let everyone know that if you're interested in following up on the first half of this, you can go to Bean to Barstool, and you can find the audio for the podcast there. Or if you're subscribed to, I'm going to guess, Spotify and Apple Podcast, you can look for Bean to Barstool and you can listen to it and subscribe to it in your favorite podcast app. Just guessing that's the way it goes. There is a post for today's episode on The Chocolate Life. There is one for everyone. The archives to watch this on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, some social media that David developed in support of this, you can get there. Previous posts that I have done about pairing, right? And I'm thinking I'm going to write a post on this, which is going to go and actually review my thoughts about all of this based upon reviewing all this media, because I watched some of these things for the first time since I posted them a little while ago. And then what I wanted to do is just I wanted to create an image for this episode, and you can't go to Storyblocks and you can't go to Adobe Stock. You can't go to any place and go find me a bar stool with a picture of cocoa beans on the top of it.
Right.
So I asked, this is Leonardo, which is a generative AI. And I said, full length bar stool centered in a white frame with cocoa beans on the, on the seat. And this is what I got. So surely the large language model now needs a whole lot of work. This was my favorite one, right? Which is really, really fascinating. So the cocoa beans are the seat, and I don't know if that's a bar stool, which is pretty interesting. This is from Adobe Firefly. It's a little closer to it, although they got the size of the cocoa beans off, which is really, really interesting. Using different prompts in order to get different things. It was fascinating to me to go and ask the AIs and see what it is that they generated from this. All right. And in closing, what I want to do is I want to remind everybody that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, as every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported by members of The Chocolate Life. So please, if you're watching on YouTube and you like the video, give it a thumbs up, throw in a comment, subscribe to the channel. If you can, go to The Chocolate Life, become a member, click on the green button here, right, and sign up. And also, while you're at it, if you're going to go over to Bean to Barstool, go and make sure that you support all the work that David is doing on the beer and chocolate side. And we will see you in the future. David, a quick closing remark?
Well, thanks for having me on, Clay. One thing I will say real quick is that I have a new book out on pairing beer and chocolate. So if you enjoyed the pairing conversation, you can head to beantobarstool.com and pick up Pairing Beer and Chocolate. It's the only book out that I'm aware of on the subject. So
this book is available on the Bean to Barstool website. Is it also available through Amazon?
It is on Amazon. Yeah, those are your two sources.
So what I will do is I will put a buy link in the post on The Chocolate Life, and so anybody can go from there directly to Amazon and purchase it. And with that, I want to again say thank you, everybody, and close with the reminder that I always close with, which is if you're working with chocolate and you're not